You have learned about the three principles of object-oriented programming: encapsulation, abstraction, and inheritance. In this video, we're going to talk about the fourth principle, polymorphism. So poly means many, morph means form. Polymorphism means many forms. This is one of the features of object-oriented programming languages that allows an object to take different forms. This is extremely powerful. Let me show you. So here in this project, I'm going to create a new class. Add Java class. We're going to call this checkbox. And we want to extend the UI control class. Now here we have a compilation error. There is no default constructor available in UI control. So earlier, we added this constructor here, which means we no longer have a default constructor without any parameters. So every time we want to extend this class, we'll have to call the base constructor using the super keyword. Let's not worry about that in this video. So I'm going to comment out this constructor. Now back to our checkbox. The compilation error is gone. Beautiful. Now let's go to our main class. We're going to create an array of control objects and render each object on the console. So we're going to create a UI control array. We call it controls and initialize it like this. Here we want to add a text box followed by a checkbox. That is enough for this demo. So imagine we want to render a form that has multiple control objects. We could have a few text boxes, a checkbox, a radio button, and so on. Now, if you want to render different control objects in a procedural way, we'll end up writing code like this. We iterate over this array. So for var control in controls, here we will have an if statement like, if control is a text box, then call this method render text box. Otherwise, if it is a checkbox, then call this other method render checkbox, and so on. So this is the procedural way of solving this problem. The problem is that we're going to end up with a big fat if statement. And every time we declare a new class that extends the UI control, we'll have to come back here and modify this if statement. This is where we apply the polymorphism principle of object-oriented programming. So we go to our UI control class and declare a generic method for rendering control objects. So public void render. Now in this method, we're not going to have any implementation because we don't know how to render a control. It really depends on what type of control object we're dealing with, because the algorithm for rendering a text box is obviously different from the algorithm for rendering a checkbox. So we're going to leave this default implementation empty. But now we can go to each subclass and overwrite this method. So let's go to our text box. Here we have a compilation error because we're calling the base constructor and passing true. Now let's comment this out. We don't need this anymore. Instead, we're going to overwrite the render method. So generate, here we're going to overwrite the render method in the UI control. Now look at the beauty of this dialog box. We can see all the parents of this class and all the methods that we can override. So here we have all the methods that we have declared in UI control. And below that, you can see all the methods that are declared in the object class. All right, let's go ahead. So here's our render method. For this demo, let's print a message like render text box. Now we need to override this method in our checkbox class as well. So let's bring up the generate panel and overwrite the render method. Now here we want to print render checkbox. So each class has its own algorithm for rendering. Once again, this is the encapsulation principle in action. So we are bundling the data and all the operations around data inside a single unit. Instead of having 10 render methods like render text box, render checkbox, render dropdown list, and so on, every class has its own render method. Now back to the main class. Here we are iterating over our controls array. Now, in each iteration, we simply call control dot render. This is polymorphism in action. So at compile time, we have declared this array as an array of UI controls. But at runtime, we are inserting different objects inside this array. So the first element is a text box. The second element is a checkbox. Now, when we iterate over this array, obviously we're dealing with different types of objects. Each object has its own render method. So this control object that we are working with is taking many different forms. Polymorphism. Let's run this program and see what happens. So as you can see, each control object is getting rendered on the console.